Hello, my name is Harold Wood. I've been an environmental activist since the early 1970s. And my first involvement with Earth Day began in 1970 when I was a college freshman and helped organize the first Earth Day event at my college campus in Orange County, California. But over the years, I've been doing Earth Day every year. This t-shirt is just from a couple of years ago here in my local town of Visalia. But I have a lot of ties to the Contra Costa County area. I've participated in the Earth Day, John Muir Earth Day event for many years in Martinez, off and on, hosting booths and participating in other activities with that. So Earth Day has been something that's been kind of near and dear to my heart for many years. And of course, as they say, every day is Earth Day. In the first Earth Day in 1970, there was a lot of concern about pollution, especially. There was a lot of bad air pollution, a lot of water pollution, uh, loss of wildlife. People were really getting concerned, and a lot of this was building up for a number of years. I had been reading John Muir long before Earth Day event, happened and was inspired by the natural world. But a lot of people hadn't given the environment very much thought at all until the Earth Day event came along. And, because in 68, 69, there was a lot of concern building on the environment. In 1969, there was the massive Santa Barbara oil spill, for example. That was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. People had been seeing the Cuyahoga River going on fire, pollution into the streams and rivers and lakes. And smog was so bad. I remember as a college freshman walking around campus trying to go for a walk, and there were days that smog was so bad I could just felt a pain in my chest. It was so bad. So the oil spill really was a culminating factor, along, I think, with the picture of the Earth from space that was brought back by the astronauts. That picture was kind of a big turning point, I think, in helping people realize we really are one world and we're all unified and we all have this fragile blue planet to live on. So when the Earth Day came along, there had been a lot of things going on college campuses around anti-Vietnam War and other kinds of protests. And what Senator Gaylord Nelson thought was, let's energize some of that energy, take some of that energy and put it into a positive thing to raise the level of concern about the Earth and the environment. And his idea was not to make it a protest movement or a march. It was to be called a teach-in, an environmental teach-in. And that was how it was billed. Of course, once it started getting local, there were marches and there were protests and there were demonstrations, but there was a lot of public speakers, there were films, a lot of things going on. In my campus, it was a fairly small college, so a lot of what we did was had tables set out in the quad with all kinds of information that I got from various environmental groups, from the Lung Association, from the Sierra Club, from the Planned Parenthood, and so on. So all of these issues were being kind of brought together kind of for the first time in terms of what public knowledge was aware of at that time. One of the things that was really important about that first Earth Day was how bipartisan the effort was. Although Senator Nelson was a Democrat, he wanted it to be a bipartisan effort, and he recruited Pete McCloskey, who was a Republican congressman from the East Bay area, represented most of Contra Costa County at that time. And he joined in as the co-chair of this environmental committee that was established to try to promote Earth Day in college campuses all around the world, or all around the United States, I should say. I wanted to mention that what they did was they hired a 25-year-old young man, Dennis Hayes from Harvard, as the national coordinator. And he built a national staff of 85 people to work with events. And when I was a college student, I rode away to Washington, D.C. to his office and got lots of helpful information right from Dennis Hayes himself or his committee. And it really was helpful in planning that event, as in being just out of high school, essentially. I had never done any kind of planning, any kind of event, didn't have much knowledge. But I learned that once you get involved in things, you can find a role for yourself, get other people involved, which is what we did through our college campus, and then also with the wider community, as I called up people and asked them to be guest speakers, asked about films, promoting books, talking to the bookstore owner and getting a selection of books available in the bookstore. Little things like that just kind of helped. And it really kind of taught me as a young man that one person can really make a difference. So that launched a lot of my career as a volunteer environmentalist for many years. And, you know, as you see, I've been a big fan of John Muir for a lot of time. So that's been some of the focus that I've done is John Muir education. I think one of the important things that I got out of Earth Day is in the early years, the stress was on pollution and everything was going to hell in the handbasket. And there were a lot of predictions that if things didn't change, we were really going to be ruining our own habitat. The air wasn't going to be breathable, the water wasn't drinkable, wildlife was disappearing, the whales were being hunted to extinction. All of these concerns were kind of based on fear. Counteracting that, there was that image of the poster that said, "Love your mother," and had a picture of the earth. And that was something that helped counterbalance against, you know, the fear factor, and instead promoting kind of a positive approach. And I really like that. I've always kind of tried to do that through my life at different times. The emphasis changed over environmental issues. Me personally, during the 1970s, that was a big time, not only for addressing pollution, but that's when all the wilderness hearings were being held for promoting wilderness areas throughout the United States. And so that became a priority to me because they were timely. There were things that were going on at that time. Then in the 1990s, there was more of a global effort. And some of us thought in 1990 that that Earth Day was going to be the dawning of the environmental decade. And I even had a friend who made a wonderful poster with that message, saying we're going to blend John Muir's love for nature and the concern about the environment for the future. And we're going to meld the history and the future together into some changes that will be positive. And I went global. And at that time, even though Earth Day had been celebrated every year since 1970, it didn't reach the public eye very much. It wasn't popularized in the media all that much until about 1990 when it started going global. And then it became a much more of a global kind of event. And that was really good to see. That global involvement was very helpful for the environment. One of the things that was really great about that initial Earth Day is how quickly it galvanized a national consensus to do something about the environment. Within a year, the Clean Air Act had passed, the Clean Water Act had passed, the Endangered Species Act had passed, and those were important cornerstone legislations that we've used ever since then to protect the environment. But the number one effort probably, or number one legislation that was valuable, was the establishment of the National Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. When the EPA was established, it did not just create another bureaucracy, but it created a system where all federally funded projects would have to be examined for their environmental impact. And the organizations or the agencies within the federal government that were sponsoring a project or helping to fund a project had to take the environment into account, and they had to do a study and a report. And that launched a whole set of environmental law that developed over the decades after that, that people still use today. In California, there was also a California EPA that was established that was similar, but for state kind of projects. So there's no true environmental controls. There's in the National Environmental Policy Act for private businesses, but they are regulated by things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. But this project basis was something that was a government funded things. And I learned how often there is some kind of government funding in a lot of big projects, whether you're talking about building a dam or power lines. There was a proposal in the early 70s to have the supersonic transport airplane, Concorde, go between New York and Paris. And there was a lot of opposition to that because of fears of harming the ozone layer, for example. And that was stopped in partly because of, you know, these political efforts. So this consensus, I think, lasted for many years. Through the 70s, the Republicans and the Democrats often very much cooperated with each other. And I wish we could go back to those days, because it really was a bipartisan effort, and the concerns that were raised could be developed, and sometimes there was compromises made, but it worked for a better program and proposal for protecting the environment in general. And to me, you know, how you vote, Democrat, Republican, whatever, isn't as important as we all live on one earth and we all share that and we have to work together. Unfortunately, by the middle of the 1990s, there was a pushback against that. There was a whole thing called the Sagebrush Rebellion. There was a whole movement that many Republican legislators and congressmen adopted. Newt Gingrich adopted a campaign to say, we're going to do cost-benefit analysis. We're going to say, well, we lose this many lives to air pollution, but we're going to lose this many economy jobs or businesses to regulate it. So we're going to balance it out, lives versus the economy. And there was a lot of that concern. And I think it wasn't until President Clinton came in that he started saying, you know, it's not about lives versus economy. We can have both. We can have a healthy economy as well. But through a lot of the 90s, there was a belief that if you tried to protect the environment, it would be too costly against the economy. And that was successfully overturned for many years, I think, through different decades. But recently, I think in the last 4 years, we've had a return to that idea that the economy might be more important than the environment, and not realizing all the economic values that environmental protection does bring. There's been numerous studies by economists about how many billions of dollars national parks bring to the surrounding communities, for example. And they pale, I mean, they make the old timber harvesting and mineral extraction kind of pale in significance compared to what those new forms of monetary values can come from environmental protection. Plus all the free services that we have by having good air quality and good clean water and wildlife and all those things. So those are things that we all have to kind of be glad about and be concerned about even today. So in some ways, you know, in 1995, I wrote an essay saying why Earth Day failed. And I felt that it had done an attempt to try to bring together concern about the environment, but had been so much concentrated on the negative and the pollution and those problems. And many of those problems didn't happen largely because the legislation was passed to address those problems just in the nick of time to reduce air pollution and water pollution and all those things. But so by the mid 1990s, people said, we don't really need these laws anymore. And there was a real backlash. So I've always felt that people react better to an inspiration of love and appreciation than they do to fear. And so fear is a good short-term motivator, but it's not something you can go in for the long haul. Well, I've been an environmentalist for the long haul since 1970, and even before. I've been involved in environmental concerns. And I've often found there's ways to do it in a positive way, using positive kinds of things. And I think that's what the Resource Conservation District does, is those kind of positive things that help us all have a better environment. Many of the services that different government agencies provide can help farmers and timber owners and urban people as well to live successful economically and also be beneficial for the environment. Well, Earth Day has been celebrated pretty much every year since I've been alive by somebody. It's never become, an officially designated holiday, but not only citizen groups, but a lot of cities, counties, and states have proclamations to say, let's pay attention to the environment at least once a year on April 22nd. And that date was just chosen originally because it was a date on the college campuses that fell between spring break and before final exams. So it was a good time for the students. So it just kind of worked out as an appropriate time for them. But because the first Earth Day was April 22nd, that's been the day ever since. However, it's not always celebrated on April 22nd itself. Usually it's celebrated on the nearest Saturday to that date, because it's just more convenient than to host events and so on. In Martinez, the John Muir National Historic Site has been combining John Muir's birthday and Earth Day for many years. It's just a coincidence that John Muir's birthday was April 21st and Earth Day is April 22nd. But they've taken it to say, well, we can kind of combine them and have John Muir's birthday on 21st and Earth Day on the 22nd, but we'll actually recognize it, maybe on the 24th or 25th, whichever day happens to be a Saturday, and that's when we'll have an event. But many times cities organize it. Where I live, our city government has an environmental committee, and they make sure to have an Earth Day event every year, and they bring in as many people as they can with different organizations offering booths. They bring in businesses that have ecologically sound products. They really try to involve the community, and it's been every year since I've lived here. They've done that event until this year when we have the COVID-19 keeping us from meeting in person. They're planning to move it to the fall. It's true, Earth Day is every day, but without some kind of a reminder, it's kind of hard to always remember that. So I think it is important to have Earth Day recognized on an annual basis. And it may not be a federal government holiday, but it's certainly a day of special significance for many Americans at all levels. And I'm, for one, appreciative that it does continue to be available and to be celebrated and to be a day of learning. It's kind of that whole environmental teach-in concept. We're doing that still, whether it's booths and a fair kind of atmosphere, whether it's speakers, lectures, films and movies that have an environmental theme. It gives a wider audience chance to pay attention to things that maybe they don't the rest of the year. When I think about the initial Earth Day and the hopes that we had for protecting the environment, in many ways we have come a long ways. The air is cleaner in most areas of the country. There's less water pollution than there would have been without those environmental laws passed. The National Environmental Policy Act and the California Environmental Policy Act have done wonders for making sure that projects and developments take into account the environment. I think the key word here is sustainability. That term, sustainability. And that's something, we live on a finite earth, and if we are going to be thriving into the future, we have to live on a sustainable basis. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, even in the 1970s, I remember posters and dreams that we had of almost ecotopia. In fact, there was a book called Ecotopia that envisioned that by now, 50 years later, it's been 50 years since the first Earth Day. So when I was a college student, I thought that by now, 50 years later, that we would all be driving electric cars, that there would be trains everywhere, powered by electricity, that was powered by by solar power, wind power, renewable energy. I'd hope that the renewable energy would become much more common and that we would stop extracting many fossil fuels. There were books written at that time saying fossil fuels really shouldn't be burned. They're too valuable to be burned up to power mechanical equipment. They actually have a lot of chemical properties to them that could be used for important ingredients in products that need that kind of chemistry. And the petrochemical chemicals are more valuable than burning it. And since we've learned since then by burning fossil fuels so much, what instead has happened is that we now face a major crisis in the world of global climate change. And that climate change is fueled in large part by continuing to burn fossil fuels, whether it's by automobiles or by factories. and that CO2 into the atmosphere is undeniable. All the charts showing going way up and the temperature going right along with it on a global average. And yes, the variation of weather changes from place to place, but overall, it's been pretty clear with the studies that our Earth is heating up and that fossil fuels are a large part of it. My wish had been way back then is, well, why are we still burning fossil fuels 50 years later? We knew that we needed to go to a sustainable economy, a sustainable environment. Let's have more electric cars and cleanly generated power systems. So those things didn't happen. So some of that is growing. California is the leader in the nation for solar power and wind power. We're moving ahead in a lot of areas. I've read recently that the cost of wind power is in terms of economic value, it's cheaper than doing a new power plant that's a conventional, gas powered or natural gas powered power plant. So these are all things that are improving slowly, but it seems like every step forward, there's a step back, and there's 2 steps forward and a step back. And as the world changes and as the politics change, we see progress and we see going back. There's been a lot of concern about climate change. There was some real efforts to do some things about it. Under the current administration, there's not been as much interest. In fact, there's been outright disavowal of climate change as a concern. So instead, we have many state governments that have stepped in to fill that breach, California being the leader in that area. So, again, I don't see climate change should not be a political issue. It should not be a Republican versus Democrat. The scientists are the ones that we should be relying on. I'm hoping that because of this pandemic, people are beginning to realize our scientists, our health officials are the ones who we really should be listening to for helping to preserve our own health. And in the same way, there are scientists whose specialty is the health of the planet. And we need to be listening to those scientists and using those things. The other thing I think that's really important about the issue of climate change is it's kind of like we go back to where we were before. In early 70s, I was really concerned about preserving forests and protecting forests, establishing wilderness areas. In the 1990s, I was involved in the Sierra Club International Committee, where we really worked on the idea of preserving tropical rainforests, because tropical rainforests are the lungs of the planet. And we did a lot of campaigns and efforts to try to protect tropical rainforests, as well as local forests. But they've now determined, many of the scientists are saying, it's not just stopping CO2 emissions that's going to address climate change. One of the best things we can do is do reforestation of forests that have been cut down and to replant new trees. And replanting new trees and preserving some of the old growth forests that exist around the world, that's some of the best ways to save the climate. So as a John Muir fan, I'm going, here we go, the same concerns and things that we had 50 years ago about preserving the forests is now just as relevant 50 years later, and maybe even more important, because we're realizing that preservation of forests and soil and wildlife is kind of what is going to help us survive and deal with issues like climate change. So we're kind of returning to our roots in a lot of ways, but that's all for the good. Now, 50 years later, from the first Earth Day, I think the 2 things that I get out of it is, number one, how much one person can make a difference. There was a time when I was involved in trying to preserve tropical rainforests. It was a little hard. It's far away and so on. I did a bit, I think, to help with that, but I decided, why not protect the own forests where I live? So it turns out that my city has a beautification committee, which it covered its oak tree preservation ordinance. So I joined that committee and got involved in protecting the oak trees, the native oak trees that live right here within my city limits. That was a very satisfying kind of effort. And it was something that I felt like I was contributing to protecting the environment, and not in a negative way, not in a political way, but something that everybody could appreciate. There were issues, there were concerns, there was opposition at times to preserving oak trees. But our city had such a well-designed oak tree ordinance that, for example, one area that had a lot of oak trees that were going to have to be removed for a new development, the city made sure that as many of the oak trees as possible could be left in place. And to do that, they actually had in the parking lot little places where you'd have to drive around the tree to get to the parking lot area or to a parking space so that tree could survive. It was a 100-year-old tree. We weren't about to cut it down. So that was something just a few of us citizens did, working with our city government to make a better environment. So I think that's my first message, is that everyone can find something in your own hometown to do to help protect the environment and make the world a better place for the rest of the world. And for me, the way to do that is my point number 2. Don't go around screaming that the sky is falling, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, there's all these problems. Yes, it's not that there are not problems, but by taking a positive approach that covers the idea of let's appreciate what the environment gives to us. Let's love the environment. I'll use the word love and respect and reverence for the natural world, because that is the substrate upon which all of our lives exist and all of our economies exist ultimately. So those are the 2 points I'd say, is do what you can in your own community and try to come out from an idea of appreciation and love and respect rather than fear or dismay.